Welcome to this video about serious or emergency icing encounters from my fellow air traffic controllers. For the record, I'm filming this on January 16th of 2021. Usually the filming date doesn't matter so much, but as I'll show you later in this video, yesterday something dropped into my inbox that affected what was going to go into this video, so I had to make some changes. No big deal. It's actually improved for the better. Having said that, let's get started. Really, I just have one slide here, and then we're going to look at a combination of PDF and a couple of videos. So my definition of serious or emergency icing, because there's no official definition, and so for air traffic controllers, whether you talk about serious icing or emergency icing, here's my definition. This occurs when an aircraft cannot maintain both altitude and airspeed. So what will happen is, if you think about the four forces in steady unaccelerated flight, okay, thrust is equal to drag. Okay, otherwise you'd be accelerating, decelerating, and lift is equal to weight. Otherwise you would be initiating a climb or a descent. What happens is when you get into icing, let's suppose for the sake of discussion you pick up a little bit of ice and the airplane picks up a little bit of drag. It's also a little bit less efficient on the lift. What happens is you would slow from the drag. You might have some ice build up on the propellers, let's say, and so that also reduces the thrust. But anyway, so you might slow down a little bit. Okay, operating at the slower speed, you have to bring the angle of attack up a little bit. Because the wing is less efficient, you have to bring the wing up even a little bit more. But you might slow to some equilibrium speed, and maybe you can't maintain cruise airspeed, but you can still maintain some slower speed and altitude at the same time. However, what happens is if the icing becomes more dramatic, at some point you get to a tipping point where between the ice buildup on the propellers that can happen, the ice buildup on the wings that either is happening in the absence of icing, anti-icing, de-icing type equipment on a given airplane, or it's overwhelming it, plus the ice that is accumulating on the airframe and adding a lot of drag, that all of that combines to where you cannot continue to maintain both altitude and airspeed. When that happens, effectively the airplane is behaving somewhat like a glider. Now, to be fair, it's actually behaving somewhat like a high-performance glider, but I think you all realize that instead of rejoicing because you're in a high-performance glider, which is actually kind of fun to fly, this one you've got some definite constraints. You may or may not have ice building up on the windshield, and so it's going to restrict visibility. You may or may not have ice affecting other things on the airplane and so on. However, for the moment, let's kind of think about this as a high-performance glider. A high-performance glider, can it maintain both altitude and airspeed? Well, no, it's a glider, right? You could dive down, build up some speed, level off, and you can maintain altitude for a while, but in a glider, the airspeed's going to slow, and eventually, it's going to be pretty soon, you're going to have to descend to keep the speed up. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I want controllers to think about that in these situations. In effect, it becomes something like a high-performance glider, and therefore, though it's much more serious and there's some other side effects, but ultimately, we cannot have the airplane maintain altitude as long as that icing is that serious. It has to descend in order to keep the speed up. Now, unlike normal engine failure situations where a regular airplane becomes kind of a glider, the speeds are going to have to be much higher. So normal glide speed for a typical airplane is going to be actually fairly low, somewhere just not too far above the stall speed and so on. However, in icing situations, the stall speed goes up, oftentimes very dramatically. The airplane stalls at a much lower angle of attack than normal. And also, the use of flaps can be quite dangerous. I'll talk about that because that may or may not surprise you a little bit as we go through this video. And so normally when you come into land, you put the flaps down and that's going to reduce the stall speed. That way you can fly slower safely and so on. And if somebody is in such a serious situation that they have to descend because they don't have a choice, and they're going to have to land either at an airport or it's a forced landing off airport because they're forced to descend, okay, it's going to be very high speed. So normal forced landings in engine out situations, at least you can typically get the airplane slowed down, and normally you don't have the windshield all iced up, so you can kind of see where you're going. In these kinds of situations, which is can be serious enough to create kind of a forced landing situation. It's a high-speed thing with limited visibility out the windshield. Therefore, these can be quite nasty. Now, before I start looking at the PDFs and the videos, let me just point something out here, and that is this. We already receive very good recurrent training, and every controller should have a good baseline understanding of icing. We already do a pretty good job. Yes, it can always be improved, but we do a pretty good job of getting PIREPs, disseminating PIREPs, informing pilots of situation. So in effect, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of supplementing that sort of official training with some very frank and honest discussion about when icing is nonetheless so serious that these pilots cannot maintain both altitude and airspeed, and they are dealing with icing emergencies. So in order to discuss that, I want to start by looking very briefly at the AIM just to get our heads around the problem. So the AIM 7-1-21, PIREPs relating to airframe icing. It has a note here that the effects are cumulative, so thrust is reduced, drag increases, lift lessens, and the weight increases. And it results in an increase in stall speed, a general deterioration of aircraft performance, and they give you a couple of examples about how in some cases as much as 2 or 3 inches of ice can form on the leading edge of an airfoil in less than 5 minutes. I don't know about you, but let's just take 2 to 3 and call it 2.5. If you're building up 2.5 inches in 5 minutes, that's a ½ inch a minute, right? Well, it takes ½ an inch of ice, therefore it can take the ice that you might accumulate in 1 minute. Now granted, this is an extreme case, but it takes just that much ice to reduce the lifting power of some aircraft by 50%, and it increases the frictional drag by an equal percentage of 50%. And when you do that, I was tempted to do the math. I chose not to do the math in the video. If you do that, run it through these kind of lift equations and drag equations where the lift or the drag is efficient or is equivalent to the coefficient of lift or drag respectively times v squared, what you end up with is those kind of cross over very quickly, and pretty soon you could see mathematically why airplanes cannot, with about a ½ inch of ice in many cases, maintain both altitude and airspeed, because that puts them, they can only get to so much speed and it's below the new stall speed if you sit down and do the calculations. I'll spare you the math, I'm just going to ask you to take my word for it, okay? But in extreme cases, that's an minute worth of ice. Now that's extreme. It's usually not going to be that bad, but that gives you some sense of how bad it can be, and we are going to talk a little bit in this video about what can cause those extreme cases. Okay, so PIREPs relating to airframe icing, and again, controllers know this: trace, light, moderate. You're welcome to review it here if you want. I will note severe and then one of the notes for a second. So severe. The rate of ice accumulation is such that ice protection systems fail to remove the accumulation of ice, and ice accumulates in locations that are not normally prone to icing, such as areas aft of the protected surfaces and any other areas identified by the manufacturer. And then the note says severe icing is aircraft dependent, so it varies widely, as are the other categories of icing intensity. Severe icing may occur at any ice accumulation rate, so not just severe or what this was loosely calling extreme. It can happen at moderate or light rates depending on the airplane. So it may occur at any ice accumulation rate when the icing rate or ice accumulations exceed the tolerance of that particular aircraft. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind, but again, we're just kind of starting with something that controllers should know. Next thing we're going to look at is Advisory Circular 00-6B, officially known as aviation weather. And I just want to put a smile on everybody's face for a second before we jump in and get technical here. You'll note the date on this was 2016 with the B change. The cover sheet says that they had revised it a couple times. They revised it in 1975. And then the 1975 text remained valid and adequate for many years. And so until it was updated here in 2016, all of aviation world was dealing with the 1975 text with its really bad graphics. John, if I ever meet you in person, I'm going to give you a hug and thank you for updating it from the 1975 text. All right. Anyway, we are just going to skim through a couple of things in Chapter 18 about icing. Specifically, I want to talk very briefly about what's known as supercooled water and some of the icing hazards. So let's get started. So Chapter 18, let's first talk about supercooled water. Freezing is a complex process, Pure water, let me emphasize the word pure, suspended in the air does not freeze until it reaches a temperature of minus 40 degrees Celsius. And what happens is, you ask somebody, what's the freezing temperature of water in Celsius? You think, well, it's 0 Celsius, right? 32 Fahrenheit. Well, what happens is normally what we think of as water always has these little tiny impurities. Up airborne, you can get totally pure water. It's just H2O, no impurities and so on. And that pure water, the freezing temperature is somewhere in the neighborhood of minus 40 C. And so you can get that pure water suspended in the air, and it's really that cold. Okay, and the physical reason for it is because surface tension of the droplets inhibit freezing, and you don't have some kind of dirt nuclei for it to get the crystallization process started. Now, the smaller and purer the water droplet, the more likely it is to be supercooled. But you can also have supercooled water that exists as large drops, known as, wait for it, supercooled large drops. Supercooled large drops are common in freezing rain and freezing drizzle situations. Now, here's what happens though. You can get these large drops, they're below 0 Celsius, and it says supercooled water will readily freeze if sufficiently agitated. This explains why airplanes collect ice when they pass through a liquid cloud or precipitation composed of supercooled droplets. So you can have a cloud that includes these SLDs, these supercooled large droplets. There's nothing for them to freeze on, so they're liquid below 0 Celsius. But then an airplane comes through, those large droplets hit the airframe, and that airframe is now something cold. It's got a nucleus, that can begin the crystallization process, and those large drops can freeze almost instantly and just overwhelm any airplane's icing systems, de-icing systems, okay, very quickly. That's the extreme case that was being talked about in the AIM. So very quickly, a little bit more about supercooled large drops. A type of clear icing that is especially dangerous to flight operations is ice formed from SLDs. These are water droplets in a sub-freezing environment with diameters larger than 40 microns and so on. These larger droplets can flow along the airfoil for some distance prior to freezing. So you get this big drop that hits the leading edge of the airfoil. Some of that's going to run back as liquid in just that split second before it then freezes, and it's gone beyond the protected surfaces on the leading edges. So these tend to form a lumpy, uneven, and textured ice similar to glass in a bathroom window. It tends to form aft beyond the reach of de-icing equipment. Thus, ice remaining on the airfoil continues to disrupt the airfoil and reduce the aircraft's aerodynamic integrity. Even a small amount of ice on the lower and upper surfaces of the airfoil can seriously disrupt its aerodynamic properties. This residual ice generates turbulence along a significant portion of the airfoil. It can act as a spoiler, which is normally used to slow an aircraft in flight, so this will slow the aircraft in flight. In extreme cases, turbulence and flow separation bubbles can travel along the airfoil and inadvertently activate the ailerons, creating dangerously unstable flying conditions. I'm not going to go too much in, I'm not going to go into any depth on that, but what it can do is it can disrupt the flow around the ailerons and lead to some large roll problems. Effectively, the antidote is to keep the speed up. So I'm just going to kind of leave that one there. And then very briefly under icing hazards, structural icing degrades an aircraft's performance. It destroys the smooth flow of air, increasing drag while decreasing the ability of the airfoil to create lift. The actual weight is insignificant. Yeah, you put some ice on the airplane, it adds weight. Okay, this is like adding, a 40-pound bag of cat food or something into the airplane. The airplane's still going to fly, okay? The weight is not the problem, okay? It adds a couple pounds. The problem is the aerodynamic effects. Now, as power is added to compensate for the extra drag, and because sometimes you're losing thrust off any ice buildup on the prop, as you do that, okay, and as you slow, so as you're lifting the nose to maintain altitude, because you're slowing, the angle of attack increases, and that exposes more the underside to accumulate additional ice. That ice is going to have primarily a drag effect. Wind tunnel and flight tests have shown that frost, snow, and ice accumulations on the leading edge or upper surface, no thicker or rougher than just a piece of coarse sandpaper, can reduce lift by 30% and increase drag by up to 40%. If I do the math, and I'm not going to do the math here, you should be able to keep flying if it's that kind of numbers, I said should, so let's not take that one to the bank. However, larger accretions can reduce lift even more and can increase drag by 80% or more. I guarantee you, you increase the drag by 80%, you cannot maintain altitude or airspeed. You therefore have to descend. It is serious or emergency icing per my definition. Ice accumulates on every exposed frontal surface of the airplane. That is the wings, the prop, the windshield, the antennas. Let me pause on that one for a second. Sometimes you get people with icing on the antennas. It's going to sound very staticky to the air traffic controllers. Many of you know that. That's not news. Vents, intakes, cowlings. It can build in flight where no heat or boots can reach it. As far as the boots, I think most of you know what those are. Some airplanes have rubber boots that physically expand. Basically, you sort of blow them up by like a balloon every once in a while, and it just physically breaks the ice, kind of the way you'd break your ice in an ice tray from a freezer in your kitchen. It can cause antennas to vibrate so severely that they break. In moderate to severe icing, a light aircraft could be subject to enough ice accumulation or accretion that continued flight is impossible. You're going to have to descend. This may lead to the forced landing. The airplane may stall at a much higher speed and a much lower angle of attack than normal, and also it can roll or pitch uncontrollably, and recovery might be impossible. Regardless of anti-ice or de-ice protection offered by the aircraft, a pilot's first course of action should be to leave the area of visible moisture. This might mean descending to an altitude below the cloud bases, or climbing to an altitude that's above the cloud tops, or turning to a different course, different heading. And if this is not possible, then the pilot must move to an altitude where the temperature is above freezing. Now, this thing here, I think we already know as controllers, and again, we do a pretty good job. There's exceptions, but that's not really my purpose in life here. My purpose in life is to say that whatever the circumstances, once somebody gets to where it's so serious that they can particularly not maintain both altitude and airspeed and they have to descend, that's really what I'm going to focus on here. Okay. Let's touch very briefly on our friend the Airplane Flying Handbook. Here, the brief thing I want to note about de-icing type equipment maybe seems like it's in a strange place. We've elected, I say we because it's the FAA, in the chapter about transition to multi-engine airplanes, you can have single-engine airplanes that have various kinds of anti-icing, de-icing equipment. But for whatever reason, they put it here. And that's fine. I'm not arguing with that. But it's in the chapter about multi-engine aircraft. So it only eliminates ice from the protected surfaces. Significant ice accumulations may form on unprotected areas even with proper use of anti-ice and de-ice systems. Flight at high angles of attack or even normal climb speeds permit significant ice accumulations on lower wing surfaces which are unprotected. It's because you're at the high angle of attack and you're kind of exposing the underside of the wing. Many airplane flight manuals / pilot operating handbooks mandate minimum speeds to be maintained in icing conditions. That tends to be more of a multi-engine and turbine phenomenon. You don't really see that in singles so much. Degradation of all flight characteristics and large performance losses can be expected with ice accumulations. Also, pilots should not rely upon the stall warning devices for adequate stall warning with ice accumulations. Let me pause on that one for a second. The reason for that is normal stall warning systems are designed. Let's take an airplane, and I'm just going to kind of make up some numbers here, but let's say a given airplane stalls at an 18-degree angle of attack. The manufacturer might build the thing so that it begins to blare a warning at something like 15-ish degrees angle of attack and give the pilot some heads up that they're flirting with the stall. Well, when you ice up the wing, it actually stalls at a much lower angle. Now, every situation will be different, so I can't give you a number, but suppose for the sake of discussion that an iced up wing is going to stall at a 12-degree angle of attack. This thing doesn't even kick in until the 15 degrees or so. You've already stalled the airplane. So that's why even with a heated stall warning system, sometimes these things don't work when you get ice accumulation. Ice accumulates unevenly on the airplane. It adds weight. Again, that's negligible. It adds drag, so it's primarily drag is the way they put it, and it decreases both thrust and lift. Even wing shape affects ice accumulation, and this one I want to pause on for a second because this has an implication for controllers. It says thin airfoil sections are more prone to ice accumulation than thick, highly cambered sections. I'm not going to explain why that is. Just take it as, with the FAA's word here. For this reason, certain surfaces, such as the horizontal stabilizer, are more prone to icing than the wing. So the pilot, you're sitting up there in the cockpit in one of these little GA airplanes, you're picking up icing. It's usually very easy to see the leading edge of the wing out the left and right sides and so on, but the wing is thicker than the horizontal surface on the tail, and what happens is the icing tends to build up more severely on that horizontal stabilizer because it's a thinner airfoil section. Again, we don't so much care about the physics of why that's going on. All right, but partly because of that, and we will touch on this more in the video later, with ice accumulations, landing approaches should be made with a minimum wing flap setting, okay? And the reason is, and you'll get a demonstration of this later, so I'm not going to elaborate on it here, flap extension increases the angle of attack of the horizontal stabilizer trying to do its job with the tail down force, okay? So that's about flaps, that's about stall warning, and then this is about the autopilot. Unless otherwise recommended in that particular aircraft flight manual / pilot operating handbook, the autopilot should not be used in icing conditions. This is another takeaway for controllers. I'm going to tell you later in this video about how we can diplomatically get pilots to get off the autopilot in icing conditions without in any way intruding on their PIC authority. Having said that, here's why. Continuous use of the autopilot masks trim and handling changes that occur with ice accumulation. Without this feedback, the pilot doesn't become aware of the accumulation building to hazardous levels, doesn't get a chance to feel how the aircraft is starting to behave differently, and so what happens is the autopilot's going to try its little blessed heart as hard as it can until it finally has enough, and then it's suddenly going to disconnect when it reaches its design limits. The autopilot's going to say to the airplane, I don't know what's going on here, you fly it for a while, okay? And suddenly the pilot is going to be surprised to be handed control of an airplane that, and I love how the words here are understated, it has assumed unsatisfactory handling characteristics. No, they're not unsatisfactory, they're downright dangerous, okay? So, all right, let's switch gears here a little bit. Notice I said that today was the 16th. I'm just going to pause where you can see my taskbar date down here in the lower right. Today is indeed the 16th, and the reason that's relevant is because just yesterday, AOPA dropped, their Air Safety Institute dropped a video that I want to highlight here for a second. And so let me scroll down to the icing, the serious icing thing. Now it says 2018, but literally this just dropped yesterday. Okay, and I want you to notice the date. It says January 15th of 2021. So literally this just dropped yesterday morning. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is not just because this is an accident case study about 2 airplanes that were dealing with icing, both of which were fatal to all the occupants on board. It's partly because one of them involved Indy Center in a surprising way. So let me kind of play just the first part. The first accident is the one that involves Indy Center. It's going to run just for a couple minutes, and then they'll deal with the Cirrus that is the bulk of the discussion. But let's just play the one that happened here in Indy.
It's the morning of April 16th, 2018. And a Beechcraft Bonanza, November 9345 Quebec, is flying IFR over central Ohio. The pilot and his passenger are en route to DeLand Municipal Airport in Florida. Instrument conditions prevail in the airplane's current location, and the Bonanza is accumulating light rime icing at 4,000 feet. The pilot descends to 3,000 feet to clear the clouds and hopefully eliminate the ice.
Okay, we're underneath the clouds right now. Looks like it's clearing up. We're about 1 degree over Celsius.
4 o'clock, Quebec, roger. Thank you.
About 1 minute later, the controller notices that the Bonanza has further descended to 2,700 feet.
4 o'clock, Quebec, low altitude alert. Take altitude immediately. NBA in your area is 2,900.
Okay, right now we've been getting some buffeting. We got some rime ice, but we're losing.
Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second. Sometimes with these icing situations, obviously our job is easier if the pilot directly tells us they have an emergency, they need to descend, and to some extent I really wish pilots would do that. Having said that, part of the reason for this video is I want controllers to learn to look for some of the subtle little cues that should clue us in to things becoming worse, okay? So this guy has descended. Granted, it's not much. It's just a couple hundred feet, right? right? Okay, so we're doing a low altitude alert type thing, but buffeting, that's kind of a key word that suggests this might be more serious than the controller thinks, okay? Now, he does say we've got some rime ice, but we're losing. Well, does that mean he's losing the ice, or he's maybe losing the battle a little bit? This is exactly the kind of time where controllers, we need to up our game. And one of the key things to look for and to ask the pilots about is the airspeed, because what's going to happen is we're trying to keep them at the MEA, or appropriate altitude, okay, or some other assigned altitude. Pay attention to the ground speed. Now, that's ground speed, so we can't directly infer airspeed from that unless we had a little bit more detailed knowledge, including what the winds aloft are. But you can ask the pilot for the airspeed and about airspeed change. And if you hear a pilot talk about, man, we've really slowed down or something like that, that is a huge red flag. Let's kind of play this one out again a little bit.
Before Pocket Back, Roger, you need to land?
Negative right now. We're clearing up.
Roger.
We're about 4 degrees over Celsius, 0 now.
Roger. Before Pocket Back, use caution, the MVA in that area is 2,900.
Yeah, I understand. 2,900, 456.
Despite the pilot's assurances, the Bonanza's descent continues. It's now at 2,200 feet MSL, only 1,000 feet AGL.
Before Pocket Back, how you doing, sir?
We're doing okay right now. Waiting for this ice to dissipate.
It's the last transmission the pilot will make to the controller. A minute later, the airplane's altitude shows 1,500.
I'm going to pause right there. Everybody looks at the altitude and says, oh, that's below the MEA. But what's the speed? Now, granted, this is ground speed, but a Bonanza doing 70 knots, huge red flag, and we don't train for that. If we see somebody who can't maintain an altitude, whether it's the minimum altitude or, some higher altitude that we've assigned, 5,000, 6,000 feet in an area with low terrain or something like that, and we get indications that their speed is slow, that is when basically I want us to at least consider declaring an emergency. And especially if somebody cannot maintain the minimum altitude, they're getting to the point where they're between a rock and a hard place, and I'm going to recommend, granted this may or may not be slightly controversial to some, we've got to tell pilots keep their speed up because they cannot allow the airplane to stall. And at some level, if they can't keep the speed up, they have to descend in order to do it if they can't keep the speed up with power alone, and then we're just going to have to make the best of a bad situation. In some cases, the pilot may just have to descend, and what's least bad, which is often what we seek in an emergency, is for them to be flying below the MEA and risk a CFIT accident, which if you hit something, that's probably deadly, but flying down lower may or may not result in hitting something, so there are odds there. But if they just cannot maintain speed and they get too slow and they stall even above the MEA, they're instantly down through it, and that's probably unrecoverable, and they're dead. So there would be huge risks to flying below the MEA. But if they can't maintain speed, you have no more choice about that than you do in a glider. That's going to take some advanced discussion. I'd love for controllers to engage with me on that. Okay, I'm just going to leave this one here, and I'm going to kind of note that one of the things they're going to talk about is some of the weather forecasts and so on. I want to briefly go to, I did it again. Whenever I'm in YouTube and I want to see something in the browser, I need to just close that. All right, I'm just going to very briefly go to the Aviation Weather Center website, aviationweather.gov, and just for a second, I'm going to look at forecasts icing. And what I want to look for is this one here about the forecast icing for the moment. And what we're looking for is that SLD threat, the supercooled large droplet threat. Now, when this page comes up, it defaults as just the max for any given altitude. Okay, but if I use this kind of up arrow, we'll start at 1,000 MSL, except for way up here to the north, and these brown shaded areas, that's below the local terrain, so that's why it's brown. But really nothing at 1,000 MSL. At 3,000, we're starting to get some. At 5,000, we've got more. Up at 7,000. At 9,000, a lot of that's kind of going away for much of this area down here. But right now, live as I record this, somewhere about 5,000 or 7,000 feet, we've got a threat of supercooled large droplets, including, coincidentally, about where that Bonanza went down. back in early 2018. Okay, one other thing I'm going to note, if I go back to the date that it talked about here, there's a little coincidence here. Let me pull up the date. My apologies.
It's the morning of April 16th, 2000.
April 16 of 2018. Now, 3 days later, the Cirrus crash that AOPA spends most of the video on occurs, but I also want to look at something that happened 1 week earlier that also involved Indy Center. Here I'm going to go back to the website. I'm going to go to the Case Studies and Simulations page, down here to the Archie League Award winners, and you'll notice, down just a little further, the 2018 Great Lakes Region Award winner involved a beach baron trying to climb out of icing, but it became worse, and the pilot at one point, who at I'm going to have to change that one, said that the aircraft was stalled. The 2018 Great Lakes Region Award winner, coincidentally, this was exactly 1 week to the day before that Bonanza crashed in Indy Center, and this was an Indy Center thing as well. Because it's a common facility and it was so close in time, I thought I might mention it very quickly. So 2018, Great Lakes Region, okay, and I want you to listen to some of the audio with some of the radar replay, but here's one of the things I want you to look for. It's the kind of thing you don't normally think to look for. Watch the ground speed.
Okay, for 5 Victor Foxtrot, start to descend down to 8,000 feet just to get a little bit of airspeed.
5 Victor Foxtrot, understand you descending.
I'll pause for 1 second. 107 knots is usually pretty slow for a Bonanza or a Baron.
8,000 and Beckley altimeter 3001.
3001. Thanks. Yes, 5 Victor Foxtrot sounds like a good place to go. Can you help set us up for the ILS?
55 Victor Foxtrot, stand by, and the ILS to runway 19er. Let me talk to Charleston Approach. They usually work those, and they'll probably have vectors for you momentarily.
5 Victor Fox, thank you. Stand 5 Victor Fox is descending below 8,000. We are stalling.
55 Victor Foxtrot, roger, maintain 6,000, that's the lowest IFR altitude I can offer you, actually 5,600, so maintain at or above 5,600 if you're able to understand you're stalling at this time.
See you, 5 Victor Fox.
Number 55 Victor Foxtrot, 5,600 is the lowest IFR altitude I can offer you, understand you're stalling at this time.
Alright, 5 Victor Fox, out of 7.5 to 6,000, and we are under control.
Number 55 Victor Foxtrot, roger, understand you have it under control, and stand by, we'll get you a turn. And turn right heading, you have a 010 if you have the aircraft under control now. If you're able to 010 heading, that's vectors out.
I'm going to pause for a second. The speed did pick up. I really do not think that the airplane was in something like a full stall for a couple reasons. One, they maintained directional control. Two, the ground speed never changed that much. Three, you never saw a big high descent rate and so on. Having said that, I think they were buffeting and really flirting, but the pilot did a fantastic job. I'm stalling, I'm descending, okay, and the controller did the right thing in clearing the airplane down right away. But I also want to point something out. There's, again, a little subtle detail here. Turn right if you have the aircraft under control now. If I wanted to really nitpick, I would move that up and just verify if you have the airplane under control and can accept a turn left to whatever heading we're going to issue them in that case and so on. It's important, you know, this pilot has just gotten it under control after a stall, okay? Be very careful about issuing a turn right away. It's the time when we need to kind of ditch some of the normal stuff we do.
LS runway 19er Beckley Airport.
Pay attention to the ground speed.
Okay, that's going to be a left turn 010 for Baron 5 Victor Fox.
Number 55 Victor Foxtrot, are you losing any of that icing?
Negative.
5 Victor Foxtrot.
Can you give us the identifier for Baron 5 Victor Fox?
55 Victor Foxtrot, Bravo Kilo Whiskey, is that what you were looking for, the identifier for Beckley?
Affirmative.
Number 55 Victor Foxtrot, it's the Bravo Kilo Whiskey Airport, just off your right wing currently in about 3 miles, and If you need the current NOTAMs, we have those available as well.
Out of this time, thank you. Heading 010 now.
55 Victor Foxtrot, Roger.
Hazard, Charleston.
Hazard.
When you switch...
I'm going to go ahead and end it there, but basically you see the ground speed pickup. Some of that is because of the winds aloft. The airplane had been southbound, it turns eastbound, picks up a little bit of ground speed, but the bulk of that is an airspeed change for what it's worth. And the airplane did land successfully at Beckley. I'm going to skip the later part of the video. One of the points is that we really want to pay attention to the ground speed. Ask the pilot for their airspeed. Okay, and at some point, if they get to some kind of airspeed, ask them if that's the speed that they want for their minimum speed, and remind them if they need to keep their speed up and they have to descend, I can only clear you to whatever that minimum altitude might be in a given situation. But if you have to keep your speed up, keep your speed up. We don't want to clear them below the MEA, but we do want to remind them that they have to keep the speed up. That might be controversial. Maybe some controllers are going to have a different take on that. If so, I appreciate that, and we can kind of work through that and so on. All right, the next thing I want to look at is very briefly, and I'm getting smarter. I finally came out of this the right way, and we are going to go back to the useful YouTube videos, and we are going to watch just about a minute of a NASA instructional video that's also on the website here. Give me 1 second to get to the... Nope, I went too far. My apologies. Serious icing. This one here. That's the wrong video. I want the FAA instructional video.
And when you might expect them to occur.
This animation illustrates the tail stall phenomenon. The center of gravity of an airplane is almost always forward of the wing's center of lift. The forces acting at these 2 points cause a nose-down pitching moment, which must be counteracted by the horizontal tail. When the flaps are extended, several things happen simultaneously. The wing's center of lift moves aft, creating a larger nose-down pitching moment that the horizontal stabilizer must overcome. The tail angle of attack increases. This is due to the increased wing downwash, which naturally generates more downward lift by the tail.
I'm going to just pause there. You're, of course, welcome to watch the entire video. It's excellent. But I'm going to point out what they're talking about here is when you put the flaps down, that has effects which, whether you fully comprehend what they're getting at or not, it leads to what's known as a tailplane stall. And so when the tail stalls, you lose that downward force on the tail that you normally have. That's equivalent to adding upward force to the tail. What happens if you push the tail up? The nose comes down. Very quickly, let me come out of this. I'm going to take you to just one NTSB report. This was a Piper Seneca, Des Moines, Iowa, back in 1996. The pilot was the only person aboard. He was seriously injured. The pilot said that upon crossing the runway threshold and going to 25 degrees of flaps, quote, the airplane pitched down, unquote. He immediately released the flaps, added power, but the airplane was basically uncontrollable at this point. At that point, the pilot reduced power, lowered the flaps prior to striking the runway. It struck the runway on the center line, slid for about 1,000 feet. There was heavy impact damage, and there was about 1/2 inch of rime ice observed to the leading edges of the left and right horizontal stabilizers and along the leading edge of the vertical stabilizer. If you read through some of the details, the pilot had flown a normal ILS approach with 10 degrees of flaps extended. He was able to kind of get away with that. When he crosses the runway threshold, he went from 10 to 25 degrees of flaps, and when that happened, the airplane pitched down. He struck the runway. A witness who observed the airplane from the ground stated that at about 100 feet above the ground, under what looked pretty normal, suddenly the airplane lost pitch stability, went into an increasing pitch oscillation, and these big pitch changes lasted approximately 4 seconds and likely would have continued longer, except that the airplane struck the runway at that point, and there was heavy crush damage and so on. Point being that flaps, which we normally use for landing, in icing conditions can dramatically change the handling characteristics of the airplane, and so I'm going to want us to talk about this with pilots. Therefore, let me just kind of end this way, and I want to go back to the text that we looked at earlier in the Airplane Flying Handbook, because I talked about there being a couple of different takeaways for controllers. One had to do with the stall warning devices. That's an FYI. There's nothing we're really going to do other than have an awareness of it. But remember, you have this thing about the minimum flap setting because of the tail icing up and leading to the tail stall or just tail, we'll call it misbehavior phenomena like we saw with that Seneca in Des Moines. And therefore, how can we as controllers talk to pilots about this? Now, we don't want to intrude on PIC authority, so what probably needs some work. I'd love to get some other input on this, but what I'm tentatively recommending is that we just use very diplomatic language and kind of ask them what their thinking is. So the way I would put it is something like, with specific verbiage to be developed that we can put into a checklist so we can remind pilots. But if somebody is going to make an approach and they are iced up on the airplane, what we might do is basically appropriate this language straight out of the airplane flying handbook. We know it's backed up by NASA and the FAA and so on, and just remind pilots that the airplane flying handbook suggests that you do the landing, approach, and the touchdown with the minimum flap setting possible, if at all possible. Your aircraft POH might say the same thing. What are your plans for flap use on approach and landing? All we're doing is kind of putting the bug in the pilot's ear. It's still up to the pilot, but at least that way the pilot has to kind of go, well, and maybe they say, I'm going to use normal flaps. Guess what? They're PIC. They're allowed to do that. But I'm talking about just reminding them of this very diplomatically. They can still do what they want. The other similar kind of thing, I think, should be done with the autopilot. Autopilots are dangerous when you get into severe icing, and so many people are flying on autopilot so much of the time these days that one of the changes I'd like to see controllers make, whether it's really an emergency icing or just any icing, is make it a force of habit that we always ask pilots if they are on autopilot. So if somebody says, and again, this is more for the GA community, not for the turbine folks, but certainly by the time we get to piston engine airplanes, okay, if somebody says they're picking up icing, I would recommend a change for us that we just ask them. We're not telling them what to do. We just ask them if their autopilot is on. And certainly if they're getting into any kind of serious type icing, if you detect that their voice is becoming strained, that they're definitely stressed, that you're looking at this little cue about buffeting or they can't maintain an altitude. Certainly they say they're stalling, or it appears that they stall, or it looks like their speed is getting low. I would just, again, maybe with verbiage to be developed, remind them, experts highly recommend that autopilots are off for serious icing. Are you going to fly autopilot on or off? Again, we're kind of putting the bug in their ear. I admit it. We're leaning on them a little bit. It's still the PIC authority. But in all of these cases, consider asking them what their speed is and remind them that if they think they're anywhere close to a stall, they're going to have to keep their speed up. And controllers understand that in the worst of these situations, some of these airplanes are going to behave kind of like high-speed, high-performance gliders. And in some cases, they may have no choice but to make a high-speed forced landing somewhere. I'm not looking forward to those when they occur on rare occasions, but we have to understand that's possible, especially when there are supercooled large droplets around. Thank you.